It was a misty morning in late October, when the village of Little Daring, tucked neatly between the rolling hills of Hampshire, awoke to a peculiar stillness. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and chimney smoke, and the cobbled lanes glistened from last night's drizzle. It was the kind of morning when time seemed to linger, when shopkeepers were slow to lift shutters, and the church bell echoed longer than usual across the square. At the heart of the village stood Pemberton's Antique Bookshop, a narrow-fronted, ivy-covered building that had once been a vicarage. Its windows, framed with dark oak beams, displayed the curious treasures of forgotten centuries: cracked leather tomes, brass magnifying glasses, and a porcelain bust of Shakespeare whose nose had long since chipped. The sign above the door swung gently in the breeze: Pemberton's Rare and Curious Books. The shop was owned by Mr. Harold Pemberton, a man of 65 with thin spectacles, and the manner of one who had spent a lifetime among dust and silence. He was known in Little Daring as polite but reserved, his conversation often limited to the weather and the price of old volumes. He lived alone above the shop, and though he sometimes joined the vicar for tea, few could claim to know him well. That morning, at precisely 10 minutes past 9, Mrs. Lillian Prowse, the postmistress, rapped on his door with the day's letters. When there was no answer, she tried again, then peered through the frosted glass. Inside, she saw only the dim interior of the shop, shelves upon shelves of ancient books, and, on the counter, a single teacup beside a half-eaten slice of toast. Mrs. Prowse frowned. Harold Pemberton was a man of rigid habits. He opened his shop punctually at 8:30, rain or shine. A twinge of unease crept into her heart. She knocked again, louder this time. Still no response. Finally she turned the handle. The door, oddly enough, was unlocked. The little brass bell above the frame jingled softly as she stepped inside. "Mr. Pemberton," she called, her voice trembling slightly in the heavy quiet. No answer. Only the faint ticking of the old wall clock, and somewhere, the drip of water. Perhaps from the ceiling or a teapot left unattended. Her gaze drifted toward the narrow staircase leading to the flat above. "Mr. Pemberton, are you quite all right?" A still nothing. Then, as she reached the foot of the stairs, she noticed a strange smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but sharp and metallic, mingling oddly with the scent of old paper and polish. Her pulse quickened. Clutching the railing, she climbed the first few steps. And there, at the top of the landing, she saw him. Mr. Pemberton lay sprawled beside the small writing desk outside his bedroom, his head resting at an unnatural angle, his spectacles crooked. One hand still clutched a fountain pen, the other was stained with a dark, rust-colored smear that Mrs. Prowse realized, with horror, was blood. She let out a shriek that startled the pigeons roosting outside. Within minutes, the entire village knew Harold Pemberton of the bookshop was dead. By 11 o'clock, Inspector Graves of the Hampshire Constabulary had arrived. A stout, serious man with sandy hair, and the air of one perpetually inconvenienced. He moved methodically about the scene while Dr. Bernard Tilney, the local physician, bent over the body. "Neck broken," said the doctor gravely. "Could have fallen. Or been pushed." Graves glanced at the stairway railing. "Bit steep, but not high enough for a fall like that to kill a man outright." "Indeed," murmured Tilney. "Unless he struck his head on the edge of that desk. But there's this, too." He gestured at the faint bruise on Pemberton's wrist. "Someone may have grabbed him." "Hard. Burglary," suggested Graves, scanning the tidy room. "Doesn't look like it. Nothing appears disturbed." The doctor straightened, wiping his hands. "No sign of forced entry either, from what I can see." Below, villagers had gathered outside the shop. Faces pale, voices hushed. Miss Lavinia Trent, the church organist, whispered to Mrs. Prowse that she had heard strange noises in the night. Wilcox from the grocer's swore he'd seen a light burning upstairs at 2 in the morning. Gossip, as always in such places, spread faster than truth. Among the onlookers was Miss Jane Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead. She had come to stay with her old friend, Mrs. Beatrice Northam, a widow of gentle disposition who lived across the square. Miss Marple, wrapped in her familiar pale blue shawl, peered over the heads of the villagers with quiet curiosity. "Oh dear," she murmured softly to Mrs. Northam. "I always think it rather sad when one of those solitary, gentle people meets such an end. They live so quietly that their passing seems almost a whisper in the air." Mrs. Northam nodded gravely. "Harold Pemberton was a dear soul. He once found an old prayer book for me, 18th century, beautifully bound. I can't imagine anyone wishing him harm." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled faintly behind her spectacles. "My dear, in my experience, Harm often comes not from those we expect, but from the very people we trust most. Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves made a brief appearance in the parlor of the Rose and Crown, the local inn, to interview a few witnesses. By then, the postmistress had already relayed her tale half a dozen times, each retelling slightly more dramatic than the last. As Graves took notes, a shadow fell across the doorway. Miss Marple, knitting bag in hand, stepped quietly into the room. "I beg your pardon, Inspector," she said in her gentle voice. "I was wondering whether you might tell me if poor Mr. Pemberton's death is thought to be an accident." Graves looked up, mildly exasperated. "We've not determined that yet, madam. I daresay we'll know more once we've made inquiries. Why do you ask?" "Well," said Miss Marple, settling into a chair with the air of one about to discuss the weather, "it is merely that I happened to pass his shop yesterday afternoon. I noticed he was speaking rather animatedly to a young woman, very pretty, dark hair, and dressed rather fashionably for our quiet little village. I recall thinking how out of place she looked." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't happen to know who she was?" "I'm afraid not," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but I did hear him say something quite distinctly as I went by. He said, 'I won't be threatened, miss.' I remember it quite clearly, because it struck me as so unlike Mr. Pemberton's usual mild manner." Graves paused, his pen still. "Interesting," he said slowly, "most interesting." Over the next 2 days, the investigation took shape. 4 names soon emerged. The circle of people who had known Harold Pemberton best: Miss Clara Ventnor, his young assistant, bright, efficient, and devoted to the shop, though she was rumored to have ambitions beyond the village. Mr. Lionel Sedgwick, a retired colonel and collector of rare books, known for his temper and financial troubles. Mrs. Margaret Ellison, a wealthy widow who often visited the shop and had, it was whispered, a fondness for Mr. Pemberton's company. Mr. Tobias Crane, a traveling book dealer from London, last seen arriving 2 days before the death, with a suitcase full of rare volumes. Each had reason to know Mr. Pemberton, and, perhaps, reason to resent him. Clara Ventnor, when questioned, said nervously that her employer had been worried about a valuable manuscript he recently acquired, something he called the Northam Codex. She claimed not to know what it contained, only that Mr. Pemberton kept it locked in a drawer in his study. Lionel Sedgwick admitted he'd offered to buy the Codex and been refused. "The old fool thought he could sit on a gold mine," he growled. "Said it was too valuable to sell. Well, I've been collecting first editions for 30 years. I know my worth, and his too." Mrs. Ellison, dressed impeccably in mourning grey, wept softly during her interview. "Harold was a dear friend," she said. "We often shared tea and discussed poetry, but lately, he'd seemed troubled, as though something weighed heavily on his mind." And then there was Tobias Crane, a slick man with cold eyes and the manner of one perpetually calculating. "I came for business," he told the inspector curtly. "Pemberton had something I wanted, that's true. But when I left the shop that night, he was very much alive. If you're implying otherwise, I'd advise you to tread carefully." Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her quiet observations, listening, knitting, and asking the sort of gentle, seemingly innocent questions that revealed more than a police interrogation ever could. One afternoon, she visited the bookshop with Mrs. Northam, ostensibly to pay her respects. The shop was closed to customers, but Inspector Graves had permitted her a brief look. The air inside was heavy with dust and melancholy. On the counter lay a stack of books awaiting cataloguing: the Canterbury Tales, the Lives of the Saints, and a small leather-bound journal that seemed newer than the rest. Miss Marple's eyes lingered upon it. She had a sharp eye for things out of place. "Curious," she murmured. "That looks rather like a diary, doesn't it?" She leaned closer, noticing faint indentations on the cover, as though a slip of paper had once been pressed against it. And there, on the floor nearby, something caught her attention: a small, dried petal, crushed and pale blue. Mrs. Northam saw her expression. "Jane, whatever are you thinking?" "Oh, my dear Beatrice," said Miss Marple softly, "I was just recalling a young woman I once knew, a housemaid, years ago, who used to hide love letters between the pages of books. People do such foolish things for affection, or for fear." That night, as the mist thickened over Little Daring, and the church clock struck 10, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting quietly while her mind replayed every detail: the young woman she'd seen, the argument, the diary, the crushed blue petal. There was something here that did not quite fit. Harold Pemberton, a man who lived for books, secrecy, and solitude, had died violently, and yet nothing appeared stolen, no sign of a struggle beyond a bruise and a fall. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy against the window panes. Inside, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily as her eyes narrowed in thought. Somewhere among the pages of that bookshop, hidden between the dust and the silence, lay a secret someone had killed to keep, and Jane Marple, with her quiet, piercing mind, meant to find it. The days that followed Harold Pemberton's death brought a strange, uneasy quiet to Little Daring. The villagers went about their business, serving tea, tending gardens, sweeping front steps, but conversation inevitably returned to one subject. In the post office, the grocer's, the churchyard, and even at the vicarage, people whispered, had Mr. Pemberton been murdered? Inspector Graves, despite his outward calm, felt the pressure of expectation. A small village could be remarkably insistent on knowing answers. Yet the evidence, as he explained to the constable, was maddeningly inconclusive. No forced entry, no sign of theft, no clear motive, he muttered one afternoon in the bookshop, scratching his chin. And that blasted Codex everyone keeps mentioning, vanished. Locked drawers empty. If we could find that, we'd have something. But Miss Marple, who had made it a point to drop in each morning, under the most innocent of pretenses, of course, was beginning to piece together something the inspector had not. The bookshop's shadows. On the third morning, Miss Marple arrived at the shop just as Clara Ventnor, the late bookseller's assistant, was dusting the shelves. The girl was pale, her usual brisk manner replaced by visible unease. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, setting down the duster with trembling fingers. "I can hardly bear being here alone. Everything feels wrong. It's as though Mr. Pemberton might walk through that door at any moment." "Yes, my dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I quite understand. It must be difficult returning to a place that holds such memories. But one does in time find comfort in familiar things. Tell me, you were with Mr. Pemberton the day before he died, were you not?" Clara hesitated. "Yes, I was. We closed early that evening, about 6. He seemed distracted, said he had an important visitor coming later and wished to be alone." "A visitor?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Would that have been the young woman I saw with him earlier that day?" Clara's eyes widened. "You saw her too?" "Indeed." She seemed rather upset. Clara hesitated again, biting her lip. "Her name was Miss Lydia Crane," she said finally. "Mr. Pemberton told me she was the sister of a London book dealer, Tobias Crane. She came once before, about a fortnight ago, asking questions about a manuscript. But this last time, she seemed frightened." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, knitting needles clicking in her lap. "Frightened, you say? Did she give any reason?" "No. But I heard her say, 'You must destroy it before they find out.' I didn't hear what Mr. Pemberton said in reply." Clara's voice faltered. "That's all I know." "Quite so, my dear. You've been most helpful." Miss Marple's mind was already whirring. Destroy it before they find out. The words lingered like smoke in the air. A call on Mrs. Ellison. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Margaret Ellison, who lived in a handsome Georgian house on the edge of the village. The widow received her graciously, dressed in lavender silk and surrounded by porcelain and flowers. "How kind of you to come, Miss Marple," she said with a delicate sigh. "This whole business has been a dreadful shock. Poor Harold, so gentle, so intelligent." "Yes," said Miss Marple, sipping her tea, "a man of quiet refinement, and, if I may say so, one who inspired great loyalty, and perhaps affection." Mrs. Ellison blushed faintly. "Oh, I dare say we were fond of one another. A friendship between kindred spirits, that's all. We shared a love of poetry and old books." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "Indeed, you must have been among the last to speak with him before his passing." "2 days before," Mrs. Ellison replied. "He brought me a volume of Browning's verse, but he seemed distracted, worried about something. I asked what troubled him, but he brushed it aside, said he had matters to settle concerning an old manuscript." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Ah yes, the Northam Codex. I believe he mentioned it to several people." Ellison's hands trembled slightly. "Did he?" "He told me very little, only that it was of immense historical importance. He hinted it might concern a scandal, something from the time of King Charles. But I hardly took him seriously. One hears such grand claims in antiquarian circles." "I dare say," said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. "And yet, people have killed for less than a secret, Mrs. Ellison." The widow gave a startled laugh, though her eyes betrayed unease. The colonel's outburst that evening, at the Rose and Crown. Miss Marple found Colonel Lionel Sedgwick holding court over a pint of ale. His ruddy face was flushed, his voice booming across the room. "I tell you, Graves is wasting his time," he was saying to a small cluster of villagers. "The man probably slipped and fell. Nonsense about murder. But if someone did do him in, I'll wager it was that blasted London dealer, Crane. Shifty eyes, if ever I saw any." Miss Marple approached quietly, offering a polite smile. "Good evening, Colonel. You seem very certain of poor Mr. Crane's guilt." Sedgwick harumphed. "Can't abide outsiders, Miss Marple. Especially those who swoop in sniffing for profit. Pemberton told me himself. Crane wanted to buy the Codex, offered him a ridiculous sum. When he refused, Crane threatened to expose him for possessing stolen property." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Stolen property? That is rather a serious accusation, indeed. Claimed the Codex was taken from a London collection years ago. Absolute rot if you ask me. Pemberton was as honest as the day is long, but Crane's not the sort to let a trifle like truth stand in his way." Miss Marple thanked him, made her excuses and departed, her mind now sifting through the pieces. Threats, fear, missing manuscript, and a sister warning him to destroy it. The diary and the clue. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the bookshop with Inspector Graves's reluctant consent. The inspector had come to recognize that the elderly spinster's mild eyes often saw what his did not. "Now then, Miss Marple," he said, folding his arms, "if you find any more mysterious petals or suspicious teacups, do be sure to let me know." "I shall indeed, Inspector," she replied sweetly. "Though in my experience, it is often the smallest details, a hair out of place, a smudge of ink, that prove most illuminating." Graves grunted and left her to her own devices. Alone, Miss Marple examined the late Mr. Pemberton's desk. Among the papers and receipts, she noticed the small leather-bound journal again. This time, the inspector had granted permission to open it. Inside were neat entries written in a precise hand. The last few days were curious. October 19th received letter from T.C. Must be cautious. Lydia anxious. Will speak to Beatrice tomorrow. She deserves to know. October 20th the Codex hides what should have remained buried. God forgive me if I have stirred old ghosts. October 21st Lydia came again. She is desperate. Says they will come for it. Locked drawer secure. Key in safe place. Miss Marple read the lines twice, her brow furrowing. Beatrice tomorrow. She deserves to know. Beatrice, her dear friend Mrs. Northam. A revelation over tea that afternoon. Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Northam as usual. The conversation, after some discussion of the church flowers, turned, as things inevitably did, to Harold Pemberton. "My dear Beatrice," said Miss Marple gently, "did you ever know that Mr. Pemberton mentioned you in his journal?" Mrs. Northam looked up in surprise. "Me? Surely not." "Oh yes, he wrote that you deserved to know something concerning the Codex." Mrs. Northam's expression changed. She set down her cup slowly. I hardly know what to say. Years ago, before my husband died, we lent a number of old papers to Harold. Family documents, genealogical records, that sort of thing. He said he would catalogue them. I never thought more of it." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "And these papers, did they concern your husband's family?" "Yes." The Northams were an old line, going back centuries. There were stories, of course. A scandal involving a secret marriage and a disputed inheritance during the Restoration. But Harold said most of it was hearsay. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. "And the Codex bore your family name?" The Mrs. Northam gasped. "Good heavens! You think it might have been one of our papers, that he discovered something dreadful?" "I think," said Miss Marple quietly, "that poor Mr. Pemberton found something he was not meant to find, and someone feared what he might reveal." A visit from London, the following day, brought a new development. A motorcar from London arrived in the square, sleek and black against the drizzle. From it emerged Tobias Crane, tall, severe and immaculate in a dark coat. His eyes, cold as glass, swept the assembled villagers before he strode into the bookshop. Miss Marple, knitting in the corner, observed him with mild interest. "Inspector Graves," Crane said curtly, "I trust you've concluded your inquiries. I've come for my sister." "Your sister?" said the inspector, startled. "Miss Lydia Crane?" "Yes, she was here when Pemberton died, wasn't she? She sent me a telegram 2 days ago. Frightened out of her wits. Said she'd hidden something in the shop. But when I arrived at her lodgings in London, she'd gone." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Hidden something in the shop, you say?" Crane turned to her sharply. "Yes. And who might you be?" "Merely an old lady who sometimes notices things." Miss Marple said pleasantly. Might it be that your sister feared for her safety because of the Codex? Crane hesitated, his expression tightening. If you know about that, then you know it's worth a fortune. And dangerous. There are collectors who would kill for it. Pemberton had no right to it. But my sister, she never meant to be involved. Ah! Murmured Miss Marple. Then she was involved. Crane said nothing more, but his silence was answer enough. The hidden compartment, that evening, after Crane's visit, Miss Marple returned once more to the shop. Something had been bothering her since reading the diary. The phrase "key in safe place." She looked around the study. The drawers were locked, the shelves undisturbed. And then her eye caught a small, framed photograph on the desk, an old picture of a younger Pemberton standing outside the same shop. The frame was slightly crooked. With delicate fingers, she lifted it, and heard the faint rattle of metal. Behind the backing paper was a small brass key taped to the wood. "Aye," she whispered. It fit perfectly into the drawer beneath the writing desk. Inside lay an envelope marked Poirot, containing a folded parchment, centuries old, its ink faded. But between the pages was a modern note, hastily scrawled in Mr. Pemberton's neat hand. "If anything happens to me, look to the Northam line." The truth was hidden in love, and sealed in betrayal. Miss Marple sat very still. The faint smell of lavender hung in the air, not from the room, but from the parchment itself. And she remembered, with a small inward smile, that Mrs. Ellison had worn lavender the day she visited. She folded the note carefully and replaced it. Then she went straight to the telephone to ring Inspector Graves. The gathering storm by the following morning, tension hung over Little Daring like fog. The coroner's inquest was to be held in 2 days. Graves was no closer to proving murder, though his instincts told him the old lady was right. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had quietly arranged for all interested parties, Mrs. Ellison, Clara Ventnor, Colonel Sedgwick, and Tobias Crane, to gather at Mrs. Northam's parlor that evening. "I always find," she said serenely, "that people reveal the most fascinating truths when they believe they are only being polite." And as the clock struck 7, the suspects began to arrive, each carrying their secrets, their motives, and their carefully constructed lies. Miss Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, looked up and smiled gently. "The truth," she murmured to herself, "is rather like a rare old book. It can be hidden, borrowed, or even sold, but never truly destroyed." Outside, the autumn wind sighed through the village trees, and the lamps of Little Daring flickered in the mist. The stage was set, and before the night was done, Miss Marple would see through every mask. Evening had fallen over Little Daring like a soft grey shawl. The lamps glowed faintly through the fog, and the village square lay wrapped in uneasy quiet. Inside Mrs. Northam's parlor, the air was thick with expectation, and the faint scent of wood polish and tea. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair by the hearth, her knitting needles still. Around her gathered the principal figures in the curious affair of the secret in the Antique Bookshop. Mrs. Margaret Ellison, elegant but pale, eyes glittering faintly in the firelight. Colonel Lionel Sedgwick, impatient, tapping his cane on the rug. Miss Clara Ventnor, nervous, twisting her handkerchief into knots. Tobias Crane, cool and watchful, seated slightly apart. And finally Inspector Graves, who looked as though he'd rather face a firing squad than another of Miss Marple's informal little gatherings. "My dear friends," began Miss Marple, her tone mild and conversational, "I am so very grateful you could come. It seemed to me that, rather than let the coroner draw conclusions from half-truths, it might be wiser to speak openly. After all, we are all, in some way, concerned with the late Mr. Pemberton's affairs." Crane gave a short, humorless laugh. "You make it sound like a village tea party, Miss Marple. I assume you've summoned us to accuse someone of murder." "Oh, not at all," she said pleasantly. "I should merely like to understand why a quiet, respectable man like Mr. Pemberton was found dead, and why a certain ancient book vanished with him." Graves cleared his throat. "If we could stick to the point." "Indeed, Inspector," said Miss Marple with a small smile. "Let us begin with the Codex, shall we?" "The Codex and its shadow." Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Ellison first. "My dear, you told me that Mr. Pemberton once mentioned the Codex might concern a scandal from the Restoration period, a secret marriage and an inheritance. I believe he was closer to the truth than even he realized." Mrs. Ellison looked startled. I hardly know what you mean." "Oh, but I think you do," said Miss Marple gently. "The Northam Codex was not merely a historical curiosity. It was a record, a confession if you like, written by an ancestor of our dear Beatrice Northam, one Catherine Northam, who in 1663 secretly wed a man of noble birth. That marriage, concealed for reasons of inheritance, invalidated another claim entirely. Were the truth known, it would have altered the descent of a considerable estate. Colonel Sedgwick snorted. Good heavens, woman! Are you saying this old manuscript could affect property rights today? In a manner of speaking, said Miss Marple. You see, one of Catherine Northam's descendants emigrated and later returned under another name, a name quite familiar to us. She glanced toward Mrs. Ellison. The Ellisons, I believe, acquired their fortune from that very branch. Mrs. Ellison's face drained of color. That's absurd. You cannot prove. Perhaps not legally, said Miss Marple. But Mr. Pemberton had found enough in the Codex to raise the question. He was a man of conscience. He intended to tell Beatrice Northam the truth, that her family, not yours, may have been the rightful heirs of the Ellison estate. The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Ellison's voice trembled. You cannot suggest that I killed him for that. Miss Marple's eyes were kind but unwavering. Oh, my dear, not at all. But you may have had anxieties. When a secret touches money, people sometimes act unwisely. I imagine you went to see Mr. Pemberton on the night before he died. Mrs. Ellison's lips parted, then pressed tightly shut. I visited him, yes. He had promised to show me the Codex, but when I arrived he was agitated. He refused to say more. I left within minutes. Was that before or after Mr. Tobias Crane's visit? Miss Marple asked softly. All eyes turned to Crane. He leaned back coolly. I saw Pemberton at 10 that evening. He told me he no longer had the Codex. Said he had hidden it somewhere safe. I demanded to know where, but he laughed. Called me a thief. And your sister? Miss Marple's voice was mild, almost sympathetic. Where does she fit in, Mr. Crane? Crane hesitated. Just a fraction too long. Lydia came down to plead with him to destroy it. She feared complications. But she left that evening for London. The Clara Ventnor suddenly spoke up, her voice sharp with fear. That's not true! I saw her from the upstairs window about 10:30. She went back into the shop. I thought nothing of it at the time. She had a key. Crane's head whipped around. That's impossible. Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. Ah, but it does rather explain something, doesn't it? Lydia Crane returned to the shop that night, perhaps to retrieve the Codex, or to hide it, and sometime between then and midnight, Harold Pemberton died. The mysterious sister, Inspector Graves frowned. We've tried to locate Miss Crane in London, but her lodgings are empty. The landlady says she left suddenly 2 days after her brother's visit. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, and I suspect she will not be found easily. You see, Lydia Crane has more to fear than the law. If I am not mistaken, she was the one Mr. Pemberton meant when he wrote she is desperate. Says they will come for it. She may have been caught between two dangers. Her brother's ambition and another person's fear. Clara looked puzzled. Another person. Yes, said Miss Marple, her eyes drifting toward Mrs. Ellison. Someone who stood to lose everything if the Codex were revealed. The widow trembled. You are cruel, Miss Marple. I loved Harold. You have no right to imply. Miss Marple interrupted softly. Love, my dear, is a dangerous thing. It can make saints foolish and fools desperate. And if you truly loved him, then perhaps you tried to stop him. Not by violence, at first, but by persuasion. Perhaps you went to the shop that night after Lydia left. Perhaps he told you he meant to tell Beatrice everything in the morning. Mrs. Ellison buried her face in her hands. Yes, she whispered. I went back. But he was already dead. I swear it. There was a collective gasp. Then why? Asked Graves sternly. Didn't you report it? Because, she said through tears, I saw the drawer open and the Codex gone. I thought Lydia had killed him. And I was afraid to be implicated. So I left. Miss Marple regarded her silently, her knitting needles clicking once. Fear does make people act strangely, doesn't it? A false trail. The next morning brought what seemed to be a breakthrough. A tramp was found near the river, carrying an old leather volume wrapped in cloth. Inspector Graves hurried to Miss Marple's cottage with the news. We've found it, he exclaimed. The missing Codex! The man says he picked it up on the footpath, near the bookshop the night of the murder. Miss Marple examined the volume carefully. It was indeed ancient, the binding cracked, the edges stained, but as she turned the pages, her brow furrowed. Curious, she murmured. This is not the Northam Codex. Oh, it is old, quite old, but see here. She pointed to a faint imprint inside the cover, property of Tobias Crane, London. Graves stared. Then the tramp was planted. Someone wanted us to think the Codex had been stolen and lost. Precisely, said Miss Marple. A false trail. Meant to draw suspicion away from the real thief, and I think I know who that was. She rose, eyes bright. Come, Inspector. I believe we must pay a visit to the late Mr. Pemberton's study, once more. The ink stain, in the dim study. Miss Marple moved with surprising agility for her age. She examined the writing desk carefully, running a finger along its surface. Then she pointed to a small dark patch near the corner. Ink, she said. Fresh, but smudged. Do you see how it spreads unevenly? That means it was wiped hurriedly. Now I noticed it the first day, but there was also a small piece of torn paper beside it. It's gone now. Graves frowned. You think someone came back to remove it? Yes, said Miss Marple. And I think I know who. Mr. Crane, would you come in, please? Crane entered, stiff and resentful. Do you recall signing anything the day Mr. Pemberton died? She asked pleasantly. He blinked. No, why should I? Because, said Miss Marple softly, the ink on that desk matches the ink in your pen. You lent him your fountain pen that evening, did you not? I dare say you argued. He refused your offer, and in anger you left. But later, when Lydia returned, she found him dead, and what did she do? She took the Codex and fled, fearing you would be blamed. Crane's face paled. That's a ridiculous story. Is it? She said mildly. Then why did you come back here yesterday, when the inspector had gone, and search that drawer again? You hoped to find the letter Pemberton wrote naming you. You wiped away the ink, but the mark remained. Graves stepped forward. Is that true, Crane? Crane glared. You can prove nothing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not yet. But we can prove this. She produced the note she had found behind the picture frame. If anything happens to me, look to the Northam line. Crane's composure cracked. She made me do it, he muttered suddenly. Lydia said he would ruin us, expose everything. I only meant to frighten him. Said Miss Marple softly. So you were there. I pushed him. Just to make him listen. He fell, hit the desk. It was an accident. The inspector's voice was grim. You'll have a chance to explain that in court. Crane slumped, defeated. But Miss Marple was not satisfied. Later that evening, as Graves filled out his report, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire at Mrs. Northam's. Well, said the inspector, that's that, I suppose. Crane confesses, Lydia's vanished, case closed. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Perhaps, but something troubles me. What now? The ink, she said softly. He said he wiped it off, yes, but the pattern was wrong. Too wide a smear for a man's thumb. More like a glove. Graves frowned. Meaning, she said gently, that Crane may have returned later. But he was not the one who killed Harold Pemberton. Graves stared. Then who? But Miss Marple only smiled her small, knowing smile. Let us say that truth, like an old manuscript, sometimes requires the right light to be read, and tomorrow, when we all gather again, I think we shall see it clearly enough. Outside, the fog thickened once more, wrapping Little Daring in mystery. The lamps burned low, the church bell tolled midnight, and Miss Marple sat gazing into the fire, the faintest glint of understanding in her eyes. Somewhere in that village, the real murderer still walked free. Morning arrived in Little Daring with a silver mist that curled lazily across the rooftops, softening the outlines of cottages and trees. The dew lay thick on the hedgerows, and a blackbird sang sweetly from the churchyard wall, but beneath that gentle peace lay unease. The talk at the post office was of nothing else but the arrest of Tobias Crane. Some said it was an accident, others whispered darker things, but one person, the village spinster whose quiet eyes saw everything, had not yet spoken her final word. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Jane Marple took her place in Mrs. Northam's parlour, knitting basket at her side, her expression placid yet purposeful. One by one, the familiar figures arrived. Mrs. Ellison, still pale and haunted, Clara Ventnor, anxious and eager to please, Connell Sedgwick, muttering about confounded amateur theatricals, and finally, Inspector Graves, harried and impatient. When they were all assembled, Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. My dear friends, she began softly, I hope you will indulge an old woman in her curiosity. I have been thinking about this sad affair, and I find that certain things do not quite fit. Graves groaned quietly. Not again, Miss Marple. Oh, yes, she said with that mild obstinacy that was her hallmark. You see, my dear Inspector, Mr. Crane's confession explains almost everything. Almost. but not quite. The puzzle of the gloves. Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting needles clicking faintly. Miss D. Crane admitted that he argued with Harold Pemberton, and that a struggle occurred. That much I believe. But I cannot reconcile the pattern of ink on the desk with his account. She reached into her knitting bag and drew out a handkerchief, with a faint smear of dark blue. I took a sample of the ink that stained Mr. Pemberton's desk. When tested, in my own modest way of course, it contained traces of glycerin and lanolin. Now, ordinary ink does not. These are found only in cosmetic hand creams. In short, whoever touched that ink was wearing gloves recently creamed or softened, not a man's hands but a woman's. A silence fell. Mrs. Ellison's eyes flickered. Clara's fingers tightened on her handkerchief. Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost reflective. A woman's hand wiped that desk. A woman returned to that study after Mr. Pemberton had already died, and she did so not to help him, but to remove something incriminating. Colonel Sedgwick frowned. Incriminating? You mean? Yes, said Miss Marple. A letter. Mr. Pemberton had written a letter naming the person who truly threatened him. I suspect he never posted it, but he left it upon the desk. That was what she came back for. Graves sat up sharply. You think Mrs. Ellison went back again? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not Mrs. Ellison. She told the truth. She did find him dead. No, Inspector. I mean Miss Clara Ventnor. The quiet assistant. Clara gasped, her face blanching. Me? That's absurd. I adored Mr. Pemberton. He was my friend. Yes, said Miss Marple gently. You adored him. But you also depended upon him. The bookshop was your livelihood, and he had promised to leave it to you in his will. But then Lydia Crane came, and everything changed. He grew secretive, distant. You thought she was blackmailing him, perhaps even stealing the Codex. You were frightened, and jealous. Clara shook her head wildly. No, that's not true. Oh, my dear, said Miss Marple kindly, it is quite understandable. You see, I know how such things happen. A woman living in quiet dependence, her pride wounded, her heart uncertain, sees her security threatened. Fear does dreadful things, especially when mixed with love. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. I only went to speak to him, to beg him not to sell the shop. And he refused, said Miss Marple softly. You quarreled. He may have said something unkind, or cruel, without meaning to. He turned away, perhaps to the desk, perhaps to the stairs. And then, it happened. A moment's anger, a push, he fell, struck his head. You saw the blood, the stillness, and panicked. Clara covered her face. It was an accident, she whispered. I didn't mean to. Miss Marple nodded gravely. Of course it was. But fear is a dreadful counselor. You wiped the ink-stained letter he'd been writing, the one that might have named you, and left the shop. Then, when Lydia came later, she found him dead and thought her brother guilty. Thus, she fled, taking the Codex. Graves rose. Good heavens, that explains everything. The glove marks, the letter, the timing. Not quite everything, said Miss Marple, with a small, knowing look. There remains the question of motive. Because fear alone does not explain why she stayed silent afterward. She turned to Clara, her eyes kind but relentless. Tell us, my dear, why did you burn Mr. Pemberton's draft will? Clara sobbed aloud. He'd changed it. He'd left the shop to Lydia Crane. After everything I'd done for him. The years, the loyalty! I couldn't bear it. I only wanted what was fair. There was a long, painful pause. Then Colonel Sedgwick exhaled heavily. Well, there's your confession, Inspector. But Miss Marple shook her head. Not yet, Colonel. Clara may have caused his death. But she is not, in the truest sense, the murderer. Everyone stared. What on earth do you mean? Graves demanded. Miss Marple's tone grew grave. There was someone else in that bookshop after Clara fled. Someone who saw what had happened, and decided to make use of it. The real manipulator. The door opened quietly. In the threshold stood Lydia Crane. Her face was pale but defiant, her gloved hands clasped tightly around a small parcel. Miss Marple sent for me, she said evenly. She said it was time the truth was told. Indeed it is, said Miss Marple. Do come in, my dear. I believe you still have something that belongs to this village. Lydia's lips curved faintly. You mean this? She unwrapped the parcel, revealing the Northam Codex, its leather cover gleaming faintly in the light. Gasps filled the room. I found it, Lydia said, hidden behind the panel in Harold's desk. But I didn't kill him. He was already dead when I returned. I only wanted to protect my brother. He had written to me that he was in trouble, that Harold was threatening to expose some family matter that could ruin us. I came to stop him, but it was too late." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite so. You saw the body, and you thought Tobias was guilty. But then you discovered something else, didn't you?" Lydia hesitated. "Yes. I saw the letter on the desk. He had written that the Codex proved the Ellison fortune was built upon fraud. He was going to expose it all. I took the Codex to destroy it. But I couldn't bring myself to burn it. It felt like history itself." Mrs. Ellison uttered a small, strangled cry. "Then it's true." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "But you see, Lydia was not the only one who knew. Someone else knew that the Codex endangered more than a family name. It threatened a reputation, perhaps even a title, and that person was clever enough to turn Harold Pemberton's accidental death into a deliberate cover-up." She looked directly at Colonel Sedgwick. The old soldier stiffened. "Now see here, madam, that's preposterous." "Is it?" said Miss Marple mildly. "You were trustee to the Ellison estate. You handled all the papers after Mr. Ellison's death. You knew the origins of that fortune, and you knew what exposure might mean to your own name. You were there that night, Colonel. You arrived after Clara left, saw Pemberton dead, and realized that the Codex, if found, would ruin you all." "Rubbish!" he barked, but there was sweat on his brow. "You took the Codex and hid it temporarily in your own case, intending to destroy it later. You even planted Mr. Crane's old manuscript by the river, hoping the police would believe the tramp story. But you made one fatal error." "And what error was that?" He spat. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You wore your regiment's old gloves, the same pair I saw drying by your fire 2 days ago, with a faint blue ink stain upon the palm." For a moment, there was utter silence. Then Sedgwick slumped heavily into his chair. "I never meant it to happen," he muttered. "I only wanted to protect Margaret, and her family's name." The man was a fool, digging up scandals best left buried. Inspector Graves stepped forward, his voice grim. "I'll take that as a confession, Colonel." But Miss Marple raised a hand. "If you please, Inspector, the Colonel's confession is one of guilt by concealment, not of murder. He found the body after Clara's dreadful accident and took advantage of it. His crime was not killing but cowardice and deceit." Graves sighed. "So the real cause of death was a fall," Miss Marple finished softly. "An accident born of passion and pride. But the tangle of lies that followed nearly destroyed 3 lives. Sometimes, Inspector, moral guilt weighs more heavily than legal guilt." The truth restored later that evening. The small parlor seemed strangely peaceful. The fire burned low, and the Codex lay upon the table, wrapped once more in its protective cloth. Mrs. Ellison stood by the window, her voice trembling. "What will become of us now?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I think, my dear, the truth will do you no harm. The Northam lineage was never after money. They cared for honor. If you offer the Codex to Mrs. Northam, I dare say she will see that justice, not scandal, is done." Mrs. Ellison nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. "Then that's what I shall do." Inspector Graves, packing his notes, muttered, "Never seen anything like it. You turn a whole case inside out, Miss Marple." "Oh, my dear Inspector," said Miss Marple, with her gentle smile, "that's because most crimes are not about evil at all. Merely about weakness. One sees it in the garden, you know. A flower bends toward the light, but if the wind catches it just so, it breaks. People are very much the same." The final conversation, as the others departed, Lydia Crane lingered. She placed the Codex carefully into Miss Marple's hands. "Will you read it?" she asked quietly. "Only the beginning," said Miss Marple, "and the end. History, like life, is best left with a touch of mystery." Lydia hesitated. "Do you think my brother will be freed?" "With good counsel, yes," said Miss Marple kindly. "He confessed to what he believed, not to what truly happened, and your honesty will weigh in his favor." For a long moment, Lydia looked at the old woman. The gentle face, the soft voice, the eyes that missed nothing. "You have a gift," she whispered. "How do you see so clearly what others cannot?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, my dear, one sees a great deal when one is quiet and listens. People talk endlessly, you know. About themselves, about others. And truth slips out like the steam from a kettle. One only has to notice which window it escapes from." The gathering dusk, that evening, as the church bells tolled 7, Miss Marple walked slowly home through the mist. The lamps glowed golden in the damp air, and the smell of rain mixed with wood smoke from cottage chimneys. Passing the bookshop, she paused. The window display had been changed, the Codex replaced with a small handwritten sign, "Reopening soon under new management. Books, tea and memories." Miss Marple smiled softly. How very fitting, she murmured. For even among old pages, one may sometimes begin anew. She continued up the lane toward her cottage, where the kettle waited and the fire burned low. Another puzzle, another soul healed, another quiet triumph for St. Mary Mead's most unlikely detective. And somewhere in the distance, the village clock chimed, as though marking the end of deception, and the gentle restoration of truth. Morning dawned bright and cool over Little Daring, as though the village itself had exhaled after a long, held breath. The mist of the previous evening had lifted, revealing gardens sparkling with dew, and the faint scent of lilac drifted through open windows. At the center of it all stood the Antique Bookshop, once a place of whispers and tragedy, now opening its door again under gentler circumstances. A new sign hung proudly above the lintel, the Northern and Pemberton Book Emporium. Books, curiosities and tea. Inside, Clara Ventnor was arranging a fresh vase of roses on the counter. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes held calm. Beside her stood Mrs. Beatrice Northam, who had insisted that the shop reopen. For Harold's sake, and the village's peace, she had said. At that moment, the bell over the door chimed softly. Miss Marple entered, a modest smile lighting her gentle face. "My dear Miss Ventnor," she said warmly. "I could not resist coming to see how charmingly you've transformed the place." Clara blushed faintly. "It's all thanks to Mrs. Northam. She insisted I keep the shop. Said it would be wicked to let good books gather dust." Beatrice smiled. "I only helped with the tea corner. It seemed to me Harold would have liked people to linger. To read, to remember." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Yes, indeed. He was a man who understood that knowledge, like kindness, is only worth something when it's shared." A visit from the inspector not long after. Inspector Graves entered, looking uncharacteristically relaxed. He removed his hat, nodded to the ladies, and said, "Thought I'd stop by, Miss Marple. The case is wrapped up proper now. The coroner's inquest ruled Pemberton's death as accidental. Crane's being released this afternoon. Turns out your theory about the ink stains was spot on. We've confirmed the Colonel's part too. Tampering with evidence, nothing more." Miss Marple looked pleased. "I am very glad to hear it. I never did think Mr. Crane capable of deliberate harm. A proud man perhaps, but not malicious." Graves chuckled. "He's got quite the shock, mind you. Says he's taking his sister abroad. Away from villages full of gossips, in his words." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple with a twinkle. "He will find that gossip is the same everywhere, only the accent changes." The inspector laughed outright. "You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple. Well, it's been an education working alongside you, though I'll admit I prefer my cases without quite so many codices and scandals." She gave him a gentle smile. "But then, my dear inspector, you'd miss all the interest of human nature." The afternoon tea gathering later that week, Mrs. Northam hosted a small tea at her cottage for those touched by the case. As she called it, a gathering of restoration. The sun poured through lace curtains, gleaming off silver teapots and the delicate porcelain cups. Miss Marple sat near the window, contentedly sipping her tea. Clara Ventnor was there, subdued but hopeful. Mrs. Ellison, quiet and reflective. Even Colonel Sedgwick, newly humbled, sat stiffly but politely near the fire. "I still can't quite believe it's all over," murmured Mrs. Ellison, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "To think, all this started with a dusty old book." Miss Marple looked at her over the rim of her cup. But that's often the way, my dear. Great mischief, and great good, both tend to spring from very small beginnings. The book itself was innocent. The secrets within it merely revealed the hearts of those who read them." Mrs. Ellison sighed softly. "I suppose I must learn to live with the truth, about my family, about everything." "Yes," said Miss Marple kindly. "But the truth is not an enemy. It is only painful when one tries to resist it. You see, my dear, honesty has a curious way of cleansing what deceit corrupts. You have faced it bravely, and that is something to be proud of." Mrs. Ellison blinked back tears. "You are very gracious, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh no, my dear. Just old enough to have seen how much needless misery comes from pride. A garden grows best when the soil is turned and the weeds are faced." Colonel Sedgwick, who had been silent, cleared his throat. "You're right, of course. I've written to my solicitor to make certain my resignation from the Ellison Trust is final. There's been enough concealment in that family line to last a lifetime." Miss Marple inclined her head. "A wise decision, Colonel, and may I say, most honorable. I think Mr. Pemberton would have approved." For the first time, The old soldier looked almost at peace. The return of the Codex later in the afternoon, Lydia Crane entered quietly, carrying a small velvet-wrapped bundle. The room hushed as she approached Miss Marple. "I've brought it," she said simply, "the Northam Codex. Mrs. Northam should have it." Beatrice Northam's eyes filled with emotion. "My dear child, I never expected to see it again. You could have destroyed it." Lydia shook her head. "I thought about it. But it didn't feel right. History deserves to be told, even if it isn't flattering." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Very wise, my dear. Truth preserved in ink often does more good than harm. Lies, once buried, have a way of sprouting back up like nettles." Beatrice smiled. "Then it shall remain in the village archives. Let it be read, but with understanding, not malice." Clara, who had been silent, whispered, "Miss Marple, do you really believe people can begin again, after something dreadful?" Miss Marple reached over and took her hand. "My dear child, that's the only way people ever live, by beginning again. The secret is not to forget the past, but to learn from it without letting it chain you." Tears rolled down Clara's cheeks. "Then perhaps Harold can rest now." "I believe he already does," said Miss Marple softly. A letter from afar. A week later, as Miss Marple sat in her rose garden, the postman brought her a letter sealed in fine paper. The handwriting was elegant, precise, unmistakably Lydia Crane's. "My dear Miss Marple, Tobias and I have left England for the continent. The doctors say a warmer climate will do him good. Though I think his illness lies not in the body, but in the heart. He cannot forgive himself for the quarrel that led to poor Harold's death. Yet he has begun to read again, real books this time, not ledgers. I think he will recover in spirit, if not entirely in health. I cannot thank you enough for your kindness and your clear mind. Without you, I might have destroyed something precious, not only a book, but the truth. May the village of Little Daring always remember you as the guardian of its conscience. Yours with deepest affection, Lydia Crane." Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully and tucked it beside her knitting. "Ah," she murmured to herself, "there is nothing quite like the quiet redemption of an honest heart." She sat for a while, listening to the bees hum around the lavender. The affairs of the world, so tangled and noisy, always seemed to resolve themselves in the stillness of her garden. The village restored in the weeks that followed. Little Daring returned to its tranquil rhythm. The baker's bell jingled merrily, the vicar prepared his sermons, and the gossip at the post office turned from murder to the upcoming flower show. The bookshop became something of a haven. Villagers stopped in for tea and talk. Visitors came from miles around to browse its ancient shelves. In the corner, a small framed photograph of Harold Pemberton rested above a plaque that read, "For those who seek the truth in every page." Clara Ventnor found new purpose, her face no longer shadowed by fear. She often said quietly that Miss Marple had saved her twice, once from the law, and once from herself. As for Mrs. Ellison, she devoted herself to charitable work in the parish, a quieter, humbler life that seemed to bring her peace. Even Colonel Sedgwick was seen tending his garden on Sundays, pipe in mouth, as though the burden of years had finally eased. A visit to St. Mary Mead. One sunny afternoon, Miss Marple prepared to return home to St. Mary Mead. The whole village gathered to see her off at the station. Clara brought her a small parcel of shortbread, and Mrs. Northam pressed a tiny leather-bound book into her hand. "It's one of Harold's notebooks," she said softly. "His notes on the Codex. I thought you should have it." Miss Marple smiled. "How very kind. I shall treasure it." The train whistle sounded. She stepped aboard, turning to wave her delicate gloved hand. As the train pulled away, the villagers watched until she vanished from sight. A small, neat figure framed by the window, serene as ever. Inside her carriage, Miss Marple opened the notebook. On the first page, in Harold's careful script, were the words, "Truth is never lost. It merely waits for those with the courage to find it." She smiled faintly and closed the cover. Epilogue. The moral thread that evening, as Miss Marple returned to her cosy cottage in St. Mary Mead, she found herself reflecting, as she so often did, upon the nature of crime, and of people. Human nature never changes, she mused softly as she poured her tea. It merely dresses itself in new fashions. There will always be greed disguised as love, fear mistaken for duty, pride pretending to be honor. But beneath it all, always, there is the same beating heart, longing for truth. Outside, the village clock struck 9. The world was quiet again. She picked up her knitting and smiled at the firelight. In a small antique bookshop far away, a bell chimed softly as the door opened to another customer. Perhaps someone seeking a story, or perhaps something deeper. And somewhere between those quiet shelves, Harold Pemberton's spirit seemed to linger, not in sorrow, but in peace. For in Little Daring, the truth had been found, the secret laid bare, and justice, the gentle, human sort Miss Marple believed in, had been done.